Forgotten History, The Neville's Cross Campaign, Part 2. Late September 1346. If you missed Part 1, there's a link in the video and a link in the description. The situation for King Philip of France was growing more desperate, and he was increasingly frustrated by King David's lack of action. The French king's armies were defeated and either utterly destroyed or in full retreat on all fronts, and the English were besieging French strongholds throughout the realm. Philip again sent an envoy to King David and implored David to act and invade England with a major force, claiming that the northern counties of England must be bereft of any meaningful army and that the French were desperate for a diversion that would send some of the English forces in France rushing back to England to help defend the north. This seems to be a notion that David Bruce, King of Scotland, agreed with wholeheartedly, and he was eager to assemble his forces as quickly as possible, despite some of David's senior military advisors urging caution. The 22-year-old David Bruce likely felt he had something to prove, as being the son of the famous and successful warrior king Robert the Bruce meant he needed to and was ready to stamp out any doubts about his leadership abilities, and he was keen to gain the respect of the hard-fighting men under his command. Men like the renowned soldier Sir William Douglas, 1st Earl of Douglas and Lord of Liddesdale. To David, this must have appeared as the perfect opportunity to build on his father's reputation and forge out his own place in history. It's important to note that David was absolutely certain that no significant force could be mustered to face him, and that victory was all but assured. His army was large and the best equipped Scottish force to have been mustered for many years. Scotland's nobles quickly rallied their retainers and levies and mustered at Perth as ordered by King David, no doubt eager to take the fight to their hated southern enemies, the English. By the end of September 1346, David of Scotland had mustered a vast army on the outskirts of Perth, around 45 miles north of Edinburgh. It is estimated that David's army numbered somewhere in the region of 12 to 13,000 men, in part well equipped with French war gear. It's worth noting that amongst the Scottish were a number of French knights and men-at-arms. Alongside these Scottish and French professional men-at-arms was a large contingent of less well-equipped, somewhat wilder clansmen from the more remote regions of Scotland. The chief commanders among the Scottish were King David, John Randolph, the Earl of Moray, Patrick de Dunbar, the 9th Earl of March, along with the aforementioned highly experienced, well-respected professional soldier Sir William Douglas, the 1st Earl of Douglas, Lord of Liddesdale. It's easy to assume that these men, at the head of 12 or 13,000 Scottish warriors, were feeling supremely confident that they could capture or at least plunder wealthy English towns, cities and castles, as well as potentially claiming huge swathes of land in northern England for themselves. It was the belief of the Scottish leadership that they would only face a handful of local barons and their retainers, along with militia troops, small garrisons and whatever local levies could be scraped together. So far as the Scots were aware, the northern counties had been stripped bare of troops to fill the ranks of the army fighting under King Edward in France. The Scottish invasion plan appeared simple on the face of it. Initially, the army marched southwest from Perth towards Stirling and then south towards the English border into Cumberland, modern Cumbria. They crossed the border into Cumberland, east of Carlisle, with ambitions to capture, sack or at least threaten the city, then pressed southeast into Northumberland and possibly North Yorkshire. This advance down the western side of England would avoid the major castles of Berwick, Bamburgh and Alnwick, as well as the city, castle and sizable garrison of Newcastle upon Tyne, a formidable obstacle. The general invasion plan seems to focus on speed and surprise, but as with most plans, especially in war, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. On the 6th of October, with Sir William Douglas and a contingent of mounted men-at-arms in the vanguard, the Scottish army crossed the border into England near Liddell's Pell, Pell being another name for a border fortress in the region. Liddell's Pell, also known as Liddell's Strength, was a Mott and Bailey fortification manned by a small force thought to have consisted of no more than a dozen men-at-arms and a company of archers, along with a handful of hastily raised levied peasants. Liddell's Pell was under the command of Sir Walter de Selby, Sir Walter de Selby was an interesting character with a colourful past and may merit a whole video of his own. It was expected that Liddell's Pell would swiftly surrender to the Scottish army, and as such, terms of surrender were offered to Walter de Selby by William Douglas, but the English did not respond to the offer. Once the main portion of the Scottish army caught up with Douglas's vanguard, Walter de Selby was commanded to surrender the tower or face a siege. He declined. The Scottish army surrounded Liddell's Pell for 3 full days and then took the place by storm, presumably to avoid a more lengthy, drawn-out siege, as King David and his commanders will likely already have been incredibly frustrated at a 3-day halt to capture a tiny border fortress. In a brief and bloody clash, the Pell was captured. The Scots lost a handful of men in the assault, and the whole exercise must have seemed utterly pointless to all involved, as the outcome was all but certain from the start. Walter de Selby surrendered swiftly once his fortifications were stormed and submitted to David. Though accounts vary slightly, all chroniclers of the time agree that Sir Walter de Selby and the garrison of Liddell's Pell were treated badly, as in an act of brutality even for the times. Walter de Selby's 2 sons were dragged in front of King David. They were then slowly strangled, one at a time, while Sir Walter was forced to watch, before he himself was taken and beheaded by King David's executioner. Subsequently, every adult male in Liddell's Pell was killed. Sir William Douglas was concerned by the early delay and dishonourable treatment of the garrison and suggested it may be time to beat a hasty retreat back to Scotland. The Scottish king wouldn't hear of it. He insisted they would press on towards Carlisle and David would have his glory at any cost. Carlisle was reasonably well defended and would have been difficult to capture and hold, so when the leadership of the city offered David a substantial sum of gold to remain unmolested, the Scots accepted and agreed not to attack Carlisle and leave the surrounding countryside in peace. Upon reaching the Priory of Lanercost, however, east of Carlisle, the Scots seemed to have forgotten all about their agreement and proceeded to ransack the priory, carrying off anything of value and butchering anyone who was foolish enough to offer any resistance. Once satisfied that everything worth stealing was stolen and anybody worth killing was dead, the army pressed on eastwards towards Northumberland, the aim being the city of Hexham, just south of the River Tyne, and home to Hexham Abbey, a wealthy establishment that was ripe for plunder. On the way to Hexham, the army lay waste to the countryside, plundering and murdering as they went. There was no love lost between the English and the Scots. Upon arriving at Hexham, the abbey was looted in much the same way as Lanercost Priory had been. It was a brutal affair that lasted for 3 full days, much to the frustration of the Scottish leadership. The city of Hexham was left largely untouched on direct orders from King David himself. This was enforced by David's own retainers. Though some looting and slaughter was visited on parts of Hexham despite the king's instructions and protection. After the mayhem at Hexham was over and some semblance of control was restored, the Scottish army pressed on along the Tyne Valley, causing as much havoc as they could. Aden Castle near Corbridge was surrendered to the Scottish army, presumably to save its inhabitants from the same fate as Liddell's Pell, and the Scots quickly pressed on towards Wrighton, where they turned south. They plundered their way to Epchester, from where they followed the Roman road of Deer Street through Chestley Street and towards Durham. It's not entirely clear if the Scots meant to capture Durham, but this would have been no easy feat, since Durham was well garrisoned and had stout defences in an almost perfect defensive position. By the afternoon of the 16th of October, the Scottish army reached the outskirts of Durham and camped at Beaupaire Priory, now Bear Park, where the monks offered the Scots £1,000, almost £1 million in 2021, in protection money to be paid on the 18th of October. The Scots gladly accepted the terms. Meanwhile, the magnates of northern England, who had expected an invasion from Scotland, hadn't been simply sitting idly by twiddling their thumbs. Their scouts had reported that a large Scottish force was on the march and preparations for a counter-thrust were being put in place. King Edward of England had exempted his northern barons from the muster to invade France, and thus they were able to scrape together an army of sorts to face the Scottish invasion. William de la Zouche, Archbishop of York, and Sir Henry Percy, Baron of Alnwick, fielded a force of around 3,000 men near Richmond, North Yorkshire. The men mostly came from Northumberland, Cumberland, and Lancashire. Lord Ralph Neville and Thomas Rokeby, the Sheriff of Yorkshire, were en route with another 3,000 men from Yorkshire, and plans were made to meet in the vicinity of Bishop Auckland, or somewhere further north if needed, depending on the movements of the Scottish army. The English army was not a veteran force, the majority of the men having never fought in a major engagement. However, as border skirmishes with the Scots were fairly common at the time, a portion of the army did at least have some experience of warfare, albeit via skirmishes and raiding. 6,000 Englishmen was about to face twice their number of Scots on the 17th of October 1346 at Neville's Cross, just west of Durham. Thanks very much for watching part 2 of the Neville's Cross campaign. I do hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please leave a like, a comment and subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for part 3, which will be coming soon.